Welcome, everyone. Greetings. Welcome to Network 2020's discussion on Lurching Left, where we're looking at electoral politics in Latin America. My name is Courtney Dogger, and I am the president of Network 2020. It's a pleasure to have everyone here today. We have a wonderful panel. We have a fantastic moderator, and we have a wonderful background to look at through one of our panelists, which brings me great joy in rainy New York today. So really quickly, a little background about Network 2020 before we begin. We are an international affairs organization. We're really focused on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy community. We run a number of different programs, including briefings like this. We often are recording them and putting them on our YouTube channel, so please do go check out everything there. Before I introduce everyone, we do have a program next week for those who are in New York. It's a deep dive on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's 4 sessions, well, 5 sessions. The 5th one is a dinner, but we'll be running through different aspects of really one of the critical topic of our time, from history to security, economics, energy, and then really what's to come. So it should be a really great session. You can register for either individual sessions or the whole day. So please do check it out if you're in New York next week. With that, it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists today. We have Ambassador Liliana Ayalde, who had a nearly 4-decade career in the Foreign Service, including assignments in DC and abroad, as well as ambassador to Brazil. So a very critical country to take a look at. So welcome, we're very happy to have you. Next up, we have Dr. Jorge Castañeda, and he was the foreign minister of Mexico from 2000 to 2003. So is an incredibly prolific writer and commentator these days on Latin America in general. So we're, again, very fortunate to have him as well, so welcome. And last but not least, we have Professor Noam Lupu, who is the Associate Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt, and he is the associate director of the La Pop Lab, and does really interesting research on comparative political behavior, political parties, so can really kind of get in depth into some of the different trends that we're seeing in Latin America. So welcome, Noam. We're very happy to have you all. And last but not least, welcome back to Carin Zissis. She is the editor-in-chief of ASCOA Online, which is the website of the America Society and Council of the Americas. And she's has a journalist by training and will be leading this discussion so that I don't stray too far from my lane. So with that, thank you. Over to you, Carin.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the panelists and to everyone who's tuning in. It's great to be here having this discussion at a very interesting point. As you can all tell from the title, we are looking at a leftward shift in Latin America, and we're doing this ahead of elections, in 2 big elections coming up in the region in Colombia and Brazil, where leftists are leading in the polls. We have about half an hour for me to go through some questions with the panelists before we turn it over to a Q&A. I do want to just comment that Dr. Castañeda has to leave about 10 minutes early. So if you've got questions for Dr. Castañeda, please do try to get them in a little bit ahead of time for the Q&A session to Courtney. And I want to just get going because there's a lot to cover. So I'm going to start with Liliana, and let's talk about Brazil, the biggest economy in the region, and where we're seeing a sort of, according to the polls, a left-right battle between current president Jair Bolsonaro and Lula, the former president, who is leading in the polls at this time. So while we've seen a lurch, as the title suggests, maybe a lurch to the left in a lot of the region, in the case of Brazil, we would be seeing a return to a past president. And Liliana, I'd like to ask you if you can set the stage a little bit for us and share with us what your expectations might be for a Lula part 2.
Certainly. First of all, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to join in this conversation. And I will speak to you based on some of my experience in Brazil. And a lot of it is speculation, but and I should preface it by saying that I've learned with Brazil that is not for beginners. that I always expect the unexpected. So at this point, we do have the two candidates, the former President Lula and the incumbent, taking about 75%. So it's a natural question. What do we expect? And we know that he's had his judicial issues in the Supreme Court. Recently annulled his two corruption convictions. So many would think that he would come back, vengeful or more radical. So that's part of the scenario. I tend to think that he is a very pragmatic leader, that above everything, and that he likes to see Brazil on the global stage and see Brazil on the global stage in a positive way. So my sense is that and I've already seen some signals of his moderation, moderating his approach. The private sector community and the business community in Sao Paulo, of course, is skeptical about fiscal responsibilities, and he went and has invited former Governor Alckmin to join him as a potential vice presidential candidate, which sends a strong signal to the private sector about his intention, if elected, to be to manage the economy responsibly. So that's part of the posturing. Obviously, to be expected, he will continue to support some of the emblematic programs that he has had in the past in terms of social programs and reduction of poverty. And as a former labor leader, he will certainly focus on employment and finding jobs for that 12 million, 11 million Brazilians without jobs at this moment. Politically, I think he has his former foreign minister Celso Amorim as his foreign policy advisor, and some of the statements he's made is that we're going to be pragmatic and not ideological, but we do have a very different scenario in the region, as you say. So I suspect that he will be much more moderate in not embracing Maduro or Ortega. There has been traditionally not that much interest in Brazil and Central America, or that the visible interest. So I think that he will maintain that at a distance. He will probably focus on a relationship with Argentina and see what comes up in the next elections. Maybe reviving the UNASUR bloc. I don't think he will revive some of the groups like the UNASUR, CELAC. There's just a different group of characters right now. And so I think he will be more selective in who he will engage, whether it's, in the case of Peru, he probably sees Castillo as dealing with his own issues and maybe distance himself and so forth. So I think there will be a lot of careful maneuvering and not the natural assumption of, okay, well, he supported Maduro and therefore he's going to support Maduro. It's a different Venezuela today, and it's a different Nicaragua. And so I think he will be much more moderate and try to align themselves in that way.
Interesting. And an interesting note on Peru, which has had it's been a roiling week for Peru. So note on Castillo. Jorge, I want to turn to you. We're having this discussion at a really interesting point, and we have obviously the election in Brazil, as we just talked about, but we just had the inauguration of Gabriel Boric in Chile, the 36-year-old Gabriel Boric. And then we have the upcoming elections in Colombia and Brazil with these two leftists who have many more years of political practice. You've long written about the left in the region and made the case that there are two lefts, one that is pragmatic and open to international markets, while the other follows a more populist tradition. Looking at the region at this current point, are there still two camps, and are there any caveats?
Well, Carin, there may be three if you like, because I wouldn't want to lump anybody else together with Maduro, Ortega, or Diaz-Canel in Cuba. Basically, those are three dictatorships, full stop. I don't think there's anything more to say about them. And so I don't think any of the other left of center or left-wing leaders or potential leaders today in Latin America, perhaps the exception of Luis Arce in Bolivia, and more because of Evo Morales' influence than his own convictions, would want to be associated with them, or should we associate them with the three dictatorships. Now, accepting those three, I still think that the traditional distinction I tried to make some years ago between these two lefts, moderate, pragmatic, globalized, democratic one, and one that is not all of those things, I think continues. I think clearly Arce, if you don't want to put him with the dictatorships, he belongs in the more populist left. López Obrador in Mexico is increasingly looking like that. More in his rhetoric, but increasingly in his intentions. He's not getting everything he wants, but if he did, then I think he would be increasingly statist, nationalist, authoritarian, etc. It's not working very well, among other reasons, because the United States is pushing back, but I think I would put him in that group. I think Alberto Fernandez in Argentina, partly because of his own tradition, history, and convictions, but partly also because he still has to deal with Cristina Fernandez. And they may not be getting along as they used to get along, and there'll be more and more infighting between them and with her son and everything, but nonetheless, he still has to deal with her as vice president and with her group in the Senate. And I think that there also we have a much more traditional approach. And then we have Petrov, who has a very, we don't know where he's going exactly, but he does seem to have a very convinced anti-extractivist position on a series of things, although he perhaps remains an unknown. Boric finally is the most interesting one in the sense that he perhaps is more like the way Liliana, the ambassador, was describing Lula. I think practically everything the ambassador said about Lula, with which I agree, although I know much less about Lula than she does, I agree completely. I think it can also be said about Boric, or about what Boric wants to do. Now, the big problem with Boric is not Boric, it's his coalition, and it's mainly the Constituent Assembly, which is going a little bit ballistic, particularly in recent days, and which may create very serious problems for Boric, who is not a populist, who is not a demagogue, who is not any of those things, but who has a bunch of very eccentric people, let's put it that way, in the Constituent Assembly, and some in his own coalition also.
Interesting. Thank you very much. That's a really helpful sweep and view of the region. Noam, I'd like to turn to you and some of your findings from America's Barometer. And I just want to read a quote from a recent article that you co-authored, and you wrote the following: "Voters are increasingly turning toward charismatic populists to channel their voices against experienced politicians they believe to be corrupt." So what I'm curious about is, are they looking for leftists, or are they looking to buck the status quo? What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Carin, and thanks for the invitation to be here in this great conversation. So one thing that we have been finding for some time now in our regional surveys is declining trust in elections and in elected representatives. So the perception that all politicians are corrupt, the entire political class is either sort of out to enrich itself or sort of in the pockets of the economic elites or something like that. And so people are less and less satisfied with the political system that they have, and often turning against incumbents, but also turning against sort of traditional leaders who have been around for some time, traditional political parties, sort of turning to outsiders, sometimes these sort of charismatic populists. We don't really see much difference in terms of ideology. So what we tend to see is sort of anger at the sort of political class or sort of cynicism about the political class, and then kind of that being channeled towards some sort of outsider candidate or some new, exciting, charismatic person who hasn't been involved in politics and isn't sort of tainted, right, by the sort of scandals that have been swirling around the region and the sort of existing political class. So sometimes that brings in kind of unknown or not very well-known candidates on the right, like Bolsonaro, right, in Brazil, and other times it brings in sort of relatively unknown candidates from the left, like Boric, right, who sort of emerged very quickly and is not from sort of a part of the traditional coalitions.
Great, and there we can think of other names like that again with Peru, like Castillo, who was a relative unknown going into that election as well. Really interesting points. I want to keep us moving because the time is already flying, and turn to a discussion on Latin America in the world. So you've all made a little bit of references, some references as well. We heard a little bit about U.S. pressure in Mexico, but Liliana, I want to start with you. I'm interested in hearing, as we see growing Chinese influence in Latin America, if we can look at the Brazil case, what would a Lula victory mean for China's role in Latin America?
It's a good question because Brazil's main trading partner is China. It's a very, very important relationship that started economically and has sort of expanded into other spheres of cooperation and through the various engagements, whether at the local level, at the state level, and whether it's military and security. So the question is, what will we have with Lula? I think he started the elevation of that relationship back in his first term. So I no doubt he will continue it. Well, whether he will let it go in the direction it's going is the question, whether he will temper the influence of China on policy decisions and so forth. I think there's no doubt that he was a big promoter of BRICS, and he will certainly look to it, and it does include Russia. So there's that question is, what does that mean now? But BRICS, as his one of his ideas, will certainly be out there and important to him. But again, I see him as a pragmatic, making sure he keeps Brazil and the role of Brazil and the perception of Brazil internationally above everything else. So I think that he won't jeopardize a relationship with the United States, for instance, if it means going with China. So he probably wants to, it's kind of a neutral, but it's very much the Brazilian way of trying to navigate this fear. So it's going to be an interesting thing, because obviously it's not like it was in his first term. The world is not like it was in the first term, and China is not like it was in the first term. It's not only economic.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of things that were not issues in someone's first term, we of course have to talk about Russia's invasion of Ukraine and what it has meant in Latin America. I'd like to turn to you, Jorge, on this. We've seen a range of responses in Latin America in terms of Russia's invasion. And even within Mexico, we see the foreign minister condemning it, but the president, López Obrador, being a bit more tepid and hesitant. And even I saw just before this meeting that he has said that Mexico is going to abstain today from the vote in the UN on whether Russia should be suspended from the Human Rights Council. So why some of these tepid responses, and what do such responses mean for Latin America's place in the world when it comes to the Russia invasion?
I think, Carin, that Mexico's ambivalence reflects a lot of other people's ambivalence in Latin America. Some are not ambivalent, they're full-throated support of Russia, like Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. Actually, also El Salvador, for all sorts of different reasons, which are not all that easy to understand, at least not for me, but in any case, and Bolivia. They have been the ones who have been clearly supportive at the different votes, whether in the UN General Assembly or at the OAS. In this vote you were mentioning, Carin, though I haven't seen all of the results, I imagine that along with Mexico, Brazil abstained, Argentina abstained, plus the ones I mentioned. I'm not sure how I don't know what Chile would have done or did. I haven't seen, I'm not sure they finished voting. But I think this is a problem for Latin America, because if it cannot speak with a single voice on this matter, which is such an important matter for the rest of the world, its decreasing influence in the world will be accentuated. In other words, you can't have so many countries not wanting to take a stand on something so important, and where so many other countries that are more similar to Latin America, or should be, than the ones who have also taken a different stand. In other words, Latin America could say, and Mexico can say, or Brazil can say, or Argentina can say, look, we're voting like India, we're voting like South Africa, obviously China, we're voting like the Africans in general, and many Asians. Well, yes, if that's the company you want to keep. Or Latin America could say, we're voting with Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Canada, Japan, etc., and obviously the United States. Well, it depends what company you want to keep. I guess that someone like López Obrador in Mexico, that's sort of his specialty, would like to have it both ways. In other words, have vote one way in one day in one direction and the next day vote the other way and hope that nobody notices. Apparently that's not working very well anymore, partly because they light up the votes in the UN General Assembly. It's very difficult to keep your vote secret. He doesn't know that, but well, it doesn't matter. It is very difficult. But there is this issue. If Latin America doesn't have a single stance, a single voice, it is going to just accentuate its marginal role in the world. And this is true in the Security Council, and it's true at the UN, and it's true also in other international agencies, like we've seen it, for example, at the World Health Organization, where over the 2 years of the pandemic, none of the Latin American countries were particularly eloquent or effective in what they were doing or saying.
Interesting. Noam, I'd like to turn to you. In a recent, sorry, let me just double check. I wanted to check, because we talked a little bit about your studies and looking at Latin America in particular. How do you see the mood in Latin America comparing to what we're seeing in other countries in the world? Is it part of a global trend? So this turn around democracy, about democracy, this sort of turn against democracy, how do you see that?
Yeah, I think we do see something of a global trend. There has been, in the last 20 years, not only more democratic backsliding, but that more people are living under sort of autocratic, or what some people call competitive authoritarian, right? Sort of authoritarian, effectively closed systems where there's something that sort of purports to be an election. So more and more people are living under those kinds of systems. And the democracies that we did have 20 years ago have sort of been backsliding around the world. So there's a kind of regime level global trend, and it's also been true in Latin America. Of course, Venezuela and Nicaragua have already been brought up. And then in terms of public opinion, we've seen sort of a sort of parallel trend, declining sort of commitment to democratic institutions and things like that. And I do think that, as in Latin America, that is tied to sort of a public perception that these institutions just aren't delivering what people, at the end of the Cold War had sort of hoped that they would deliver. And that's partly globalization, it's partly the sort of global recession, the last pre-pandemic. It's partly also related to the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic. And as I said, also related to corruption scandals. And some of those have been in recent years really quite global. The Panama Papers, the sort of various scandals that implicated sort of politicians around the world. All of that has really created sort of a perception, a growing perception, that politics is a way that elites either manage to sort of entrench their power or line their pockets and things like that behind closed doors. And that's really, making people disillusioned.
Thank you for that. That's a segue into my last round of questions for the panelists before we turn to a Q&A. One of the things that you mentioned in terms of a sort of global perspective on democracy, one has to think about the United States. I mean, at times it feels like we're seeing what comes, we see Washington caught in its own problems. We think about January 6th, we think about polarization. Now we have the crisis in Ukraine, and Washington really being embroiled in all of these problems. In addition, we're heading into a midterm, dealing with the inflation. So under these conditions, with all of these challenges and these inward-looking countries, as we've discussed, as Jorge discussed a little bit, what can Washington do to reset relations with Latin America's current leaders and the likely incoming crop of leaders? Is there something realistic that Washington can do? Noam, I'm going to switch up the order and start with you, as I've got you large on the screen, and then I'll turn to our other panelists.
Yeah, I think you're right. There is only so many hours in the day, and only so much sort of energy and sort of focus that you can expect out of Washington. There's so many issues domestically and sort of crises that have to be dealt with, that I think Latin American relations have taken a back burner to a back burner in lots of ways recently. And what there is that focuses on Latin America has, I guess I would say for the last 6 years, been very much focused on Central America and on migration. And a lot of the lens through which sort of policy or sort of programs towards Latin America have been directed have to do with the issue of migration, and the issue of migration being tied to sort of rising levels of violence. This is actually true across the region, but very much so in Central America, is sort of driving people to migrate. Climate change has also been, something in Central America that has been driving people to migrate. So I think, the U.S. has been, to the extent that it's sort of Washington is thinking about Latin America, has really been focused on that issue. That said, I'm not sure that there's a whole lot that Washington can do about that issue. partly because a lot of it is driven by sort of structural changes that are pretty hard to change. But I think that has been where the primary focus has been, I think.
Yeah, certainly. Liliana, I want to turn to you. What do you think could be something that Washington could do, especially given your long career in the Foreign Service? I'm interested in hearing your insights. What could Washington do to reset some of these relations?
Well, certainly there's a confluence of issues, not only domestically for us, but for the countries in the region, very much related to their economies, and it all came together with COVID and the state of democracy. But I think that I could see some things being done. Certainly the messaging is important. The narrative about the region is important. There is an opportunity with the Summit of the Americas to see what will come out of that. Because that is a stage in which I don't know who's going to be invited, who's going to be there, but theoretically the Americas is all present. And with the possibility of launching some initiatives or highlighting some initiatives, I think it's not a time to have just huge things that will probably not be able to be accomplished, but rather very specifics. And I would focus on the economics, the jobs, things that can generate jobs for people, because that is what leads to migration. That's what leads to poverty. That's what leads to a lot of things. And I think there are opportunities with the world changing. I mean, we just saw it with the fertilizers in Brazil, and how, that has upset the internal markets. There are things that can be done within the region. There are benefits of being in the same geographical zone that will cut on costs and so forth. So I think that I would be less ambitious, but more realistic in what could be accomplished, as well as a very concrete narrative for the region at this moment.
Mm-hmm. Jorge, what do you think? I mean, in particular, with obviously the United States and Mexico have a very important economic and cultural connection. What can the United States do? What can Washington do in terms of its focus on the region?
Well, the first point is that I think the one you were implicitly making, Carin, which is that Mexico is kind of different in its relationship with the United States. There's kind of everybody else and Mexico, if only because of the fact that we are neighbors, and the United States' interests in Mexico and its involvement with Mexico is far deeper and more important for the United States than the rest of the region. That doesn't mean that issues don't come up that overshadow Mexico. Cuba has had that impact over the years, Venezuela more recently, and it can be other countries. But in general terms, it's a sort of separate issue. And now, Washington is having to face, for the first time, in fact, since the 1930s, a left of center government in Mexico. This had never been the case. There had been presidents who had more or less populist rhetoric. Echeverria, López Portillo back in the 70s, López Mateos in the early 60s. But I mean, it was just basically talk. Now there is a president in Mexico who is pretty much going after some American investors, voting very differently from the United States at the UN and at the OAS and on international issues, who has a different view of the rule of law and representative democracy and human rights than the United States has. I happen to disagree with his points of view, but even if you agree with them, you cannot but conclude that they are very different. Just yesterday, López Obrador accused the United States, he said so openly, of lobbying against his energy bill, even including with the Supreme Court justices, which forced the American ambassador, who's doing his best to get along with him, to run off immediately to the National Palace to see what this meant. So this is a very different situation for the United States as far as Mexico is concerned. And to conclude on this point, I mean, it's different also because we've had a lot of presidents in Mexico since the 1930s or 40s that have messed things up. You know, we've had a few good ones and a lot of them who have messed things up. There's nothing to be terribly proud about as far as the presidents we've had. But they had all maintained a certain stability, macroeconomic, political, social, terms of violence, etc. López Obrador is getting close to where that stability begins to become more precarious. This is something Washington has not faced in Mexico since the 1930s. That's a big deal.
Wow. Well, that's a dramatic conclusion to my round of questions. we have a number of great questions that I'm reviewing. I'm going to actually start with one for you, Jorge, knowing that your time is a little bit limited. I invite any of the panelists to jump in on some of these questions as well, of course. But to start, what needs to happen for Latin American countries to become more active members on the geopolitical stage and less of a playing field for foreign powers? It's a great question. Jorge, I'm gonna turn it to you.
Well, very, very briefly, I mean, the first point is that Latin America has to try and speak with one voice, or at least Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia have to try and speak with one voice. And that means trying to remove ideology from foreign policy. What Liliana was saying before about Celso Amorim, hopefully this time around, because he's been foreign minister for 2 terms with Lula and for 1.5 terms with Dilma. Hopefully this time around, Celso will be a little bit less ideological. He can have his own ideological convictions at home, but on the world stage, it's very important for these 4 or 5 countries to try and speak with a single voice. And that means inevitably not ideologizing foreign policy. I know it's very difficult. Every country does it. Every government does it, but it's very difficult. I mean, again, just take Russia. If we can't find a way to speak with a single voice, even on this, or on climate change, or on corruption, or on human rights, or on democracy at the Summit of the Americas now coming up in Los Angeles, it's very difficult. I think that's first absolutely indispensable condition for Latin America to have a greater role on the world stage. Great.
Liliana or Noam, do you want to add to that at all? I have a somewhat related question, and I'm going to actually just take the chance to ask the question now, and you can add on to anything that Jorge just said or respond to this as well. How likely is it that Latin American regionalism will be revived in the near future? And this makes me think of a comment you made about UNASUR right at the beginning, Liliana, which is UNASUR. I haven't even thought about UNASUR in a very long time, so it was interesting to hear it come up again. What are your thoughts, Liliana? I'll ask you first.
Well, I think that, I mentioned UNASUR because those were the regional organizations that were around during different time. I think they're basically dead right now. And so I think, but the region has changed. And I agree with Jorge. Unfortunately, it's very hard to pull ideology out of foreign policy, because you have these outliers. And then so, Maduro, Venezuela becomes the topic. And so, and I think it's a matter of waves, because we had a similar situation with a very left-oriented region before, during the 2008, more or less. And so it's going to gravitate, because right now we've got a lot of different situations, and it's going to be very hard to pull everyone together. but time will make that happen slowly with new leadership coming in, you know, and there's some unknowns here. You know, what will happen in Colombia, how well will Chile do with some of the challenges of this new leadership. But I am hopeful that, you know, we will come to a point where we can have a platform and at least talk about some of these similarities together as opposed to separate. But it's going to take some time.
It's interesting because we've somehow managed to make it almost through this discussion without talking about pink tide, using the phrase pink tide. So, which you were referring to kind of this movement a little bit over a decade ago that people talked about all the time, the pink tide. And there's been this ongoing question of, are we having another pink tide? So, Noam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. And I would just add that there are so many, we haven't talked much about the pandemic, but there are so many post-pandemic, to the extent that we are in a post-pandemic period now. There's so many issues that these new presidents are going to have to face, and the incumbent presidents are facing with regard to economies and poverty and education, and there's just a lot of domestic issues. I think another sort of difficulty with regard to sort of regionalism in the region is that they are really, as they have been for the last 2 years, very, very focused on the internal domestic issues.
That actually leads right into to the next question I was going to pull up, which is one of the questions from the viewers is, how did COVID-19 influence Latin American elections? And are we seeing it as an issue in the cases of Brazil and Colombia? The title of this focuses very much on Brazil and Colombia and those upcoming elections. We've talked quite a bit about Brazil. We could talk more about Colombia probably. Noam, I don't know if you want to add on to what you were just saying. How has COVID-19 influenced elections and the ones that are coming up?
I think there's sort of two ways to think about the effect that the pandemic has had. One is to think of this as sort of any other crisis where, think of an economic crisis hits a country, the incumbent president is inevitably going to be blamed for, the bad outcomes that come from that. So, I think we've seen that, more or less regardless of what they did in terms of public health policies. And then also some of those public health policies, which of course at the time, may have sort of seemed reasonable, also created quite a backlash in, multiple places. Peru was sort of, I think, the most dramatic case with pretty dramatic lockdowns that people became very angry about. So I think we're still sort of seeing some of the anti-incumbency that's coming at the end of the pandemic. Bolsonaro, and others sort of falling in their approval. I think the other issue, that sort of goes back to something I raised before, the issue of corruption. There were lots of corruption scandals having to do with the rollout of the vaccines in Peru, in Mexico, in Argentina. I mean, just so many cases in which, again, what sort of the public sees is politicians sort of using their power to gain advantage for, their friends or their families and things like that, before everybody else. And that, again, I think has had this kind of anti-incumbency sort of feature to it, and again, made kind of outsiders more appealing, right? Who are, the honest anti-corruption outsiders, right? Of course, we don't know if they're honest or anti-corruption because they're outsiders, but but they sort of come in with that sort of rhetoric, and I think that's been and continues to be part of the challenger rhetoric that seems to be working in some places.
I have so many good questions coming in, so I'm actually gonna keep moving on, unless one of the other panelists wants to. No, okay, because there are two questions that came in that are somewhat connected, and they're a little bit specific. So it's interesting. Given the political, economic, and humanitarian importance of Latin American migrants in the U.S., what might be the perspectives of the U.S. Considering a form of Marshall Plan in collaboration with the OAS? And a second sort of related question, is a new Monroe Doctrine against China's growing influence in Latin America possible? Two big questions. And Jorge, I'm going to start with you, as I know you've got limited time.
Oh, thank you, Carin. On both, I mean, I think, this is what the current government in Mexico, López Obrador's government, has been saying both to the Trump and to the Biden administrations, and I agree completely with him on this score. Without, you can call it a Marshall Plan or call it an Alliance for Progress or call it Alliance for Prosperity, it doesn't make any difference. Without a lot of money poured into the Northern Triangle countries, perhaps a few other places, and certainly certain regions of Mexico, it is very difficult to really discourage or reduce significantly the volumes of migration, even from Mexico. Migration from Mexico is way up again, as we should be expected, given the current economic situation and violence and everything in Mexico. The problem, of course, is that, remember, the Marshall Plan was U.S. federal money that President Truman was able to come up with. It wasn't asking the private sector to invest. Some private investors did invest in Western Europe because the federal government was throwing money at it, but not on their own. And the same is true now. You got to be kind of crazy to be a significant foreign and American investor and go and invest money in El Salvador today. Why in the world would you do that? What, you're going to invest in prisons to put more gang members in? I mean, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And unfortunately, the executive, whether it was Trump before or Biden now, do not seem to be able to do a whole lot in terms of getting that kind of money from the Congress. It just doesn't seem very viable. On China, finally, I think it depends a great deal on the countries. I think the United States will end up resigning itself to the fact that countries like Brazil, Chile, Peru, Argentina are going to have increasingly close ties to China, that as long as that doesn't become geopolitical, ideological, etc., military, well, too bad, that's the way it is. Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean, I think is a different story. I think the United States has been already and will continue to be much more orthodox, much more conservative in terms of letting the Mexicans and the Central Americans and some of the Caribbean countries know that there is a limit to how friendly you can get with the Chinese. Yes, okay, some things are fine, but 5G, líneas troncales, I don't know how that's said in English, fiber optics leading up to the U.S. border with Mexico for Huawei. Guess what, guys? Maybe that's not a good idea. I think we will see a difference between the two areas of Latin America.
Interesting. Liliana, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree that there's a bandwidth issue about competing. I mean, we can see it, but you have to be there. You have to have the resources. And the U.S. government doesn't control the private sector to make the investments, doesn't have the big banks and to direct them, to this port or construction or so forth. So there are certain realities about our transparency, the way we do business, our values that are not going to change. So in a way, it's what Jorge says, it's a given, right? And but there will be some red lines, and we will continue to look at those. And if it relates to security, they're more sensitive. where I expect that we will find a way to make those messages loud and clear as to our concerns, and that is not only not in our best interest, but in their best interest, because at the end of the day, it's about this competition. But the individual countries need to see that it's in their benefit or not. So,
Liliana, I'd like to stay with you for a minute with a particular question related to climate change. One of the biggest climate change and environmental challenges for the next decade relates to our agricultural supply chain, both to improve food sustainability and as a fossil-free source of hydrocarbons. Brazil has built a significant domestic biofuels industry. What are the implications of current politics in the growth of a bioeconomy in Brazil and beyond? It's a very good question.
It's a good question, and particularly, both Brazil and the United States are the two biggest food producers. So these are definitely issues, and we will continue to be. So, environmental issues under the current administration have been somewhat controversial when looking at climate change. That I should have mentioned, and that's certainly one of the topics or the themes that would be prioritized under a Lula administration, and certainly looking at conservation and some of these issues. And I don't have the expertise to know exactly what would be recommended to try to address that, but certainly it's something that is a growing concern.
Thank you. I think I might be wrong, but I think I've gone through most of the questions I see in here. Courtney, tell me if I'm missing.
There are actually some more. I have not pulled all of them from the Q&A box, so I can send you some more.
I have one that I would like to squeeze in really quickly, which is that, and Noam, this might be one for you, but in recent days, because we're in a world where things change so quickly all the time, the polling from what I've seen in the case of Colombia is putting Petro closer to a sort of right-wing candidate, Fico Gutierrez. And as I understand it, also in Brazil, you have a case now where Sergio Moro, who was polling third, has dropped out of the race. So it's now, again, also becoming a left-right race between Lula and Bolsonaro. I'd love your views, because we're talking here as though, is Latin America lurching left? Is it? That's the actual question. Is it lurching left? I'm not really sure if we look at recent polls. Noam, if you want to start, and Liliana, I'd love to hear your views in the case of Brazil.
Yeah, I think, so if the question is it lurching left in terms of, public opinion, and, the public in Latin America wants a leftist in government, I would say no. It's not. I think it's mostly that's not how people pick their favored candidates. I think where we are likely to see at the government level more leftist governments, I think we are likely to see more leftist governments after this sort of next wave of elections, and that's partly because we currently have a bunch of center-left incumbents. And the public is turning against incumbents in general as things have been declining. I think that partly explains what happened in Chile. I think legislative elections in Argentina last year also sort of went to the center right, because you have this incumbent center left president. So I think we're likely to see this kind of anti-incumbency. And since these things tend to happen in waves, the elections happen in waves in the region, that's, I think a lot of why we saw this pink tide, right? And then the kind of return of more sort of center-right governments in a number of countries, and now we're sort of at the end of that wave.
Great. Liliana, what are your views, particularly in the case of Brazil?
Yeah, well, in both cases, like to make some comments. So it's interesting in the case of Brazil, when Moro pulled out, his votes increased Bolsonaro's standing. And in my context right now, there is, and that's why I said expect the unexpected, because you never know. You know, people are saying that it's not too far-fetched that, you know, he could get elected despite this 10% difference in the polls, which were taken maybe about a week ago. So, you know, things do evolve. And in the case of Colombia, the elections for the, I guess it was the March 8th elections, which were, you know, to the primaries, that resulted in also generating some differences in the dynamics. And I think and I wouldn't call Fico necessarily a right, extreme right, you know, because I think he's been trying to move more to the center, and because he knows that people want something different. So it'll be interesting to watch. And in the case of these two countries that probably are a little bit not as traditional as the rest. So we'll have to see. But I think it's just interesting moment to see how the polling is going vis-a-vis what people are really thinking.
Mm-hmm. Really great points. And it's interesting in the case of Colombia, where we had Álvaro Uribe dominating politics for so many years. It is true that to a certain degree, being centrist is bucking the status quo as well. So, we have only a couple of minutes. Courtney, can I just ask a couple of? I'm gonna do a sort of potpourri of questions, and you guys can decide which ones you want to answer in closing comments from each of you. I have one question about whether Lula was unfairly persecuted in Brazil, or was there legitimate corruption? How can economic assistance help with the social problems in Latin America if inequality stays the same? Since Bolsonaro's policies violated the Paris Agreement, can we see more efforts toward climate change, ameliorating climate change problems under Lula? And how important is the topic in constituencies over the continent? Oh, that's a big question, I admit. Sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you guys, I know. With the likelihood of more left-leaning, and you guys get to pick which one, with the likelihood of more left-leaning countries in Latin America, what does this mean for Cuba? Will we likely see greater ties or trade with Havana? And this one, Liliana, is somewhat to you. Where do you see Brazil heading if Bolsonaro does manage to get reelected? With that, Liliana, I'll start with you because that's a great sort of closing question in there.
So I guess I would start by saying that I wouldn't discard the possibility of a Bolsonaro win, despite the 10% difference right now. Elections are not until October. Official campaigns don't start. Official campaigning doesn't start until August. So I think we can anticipate some very robust campaigning, good or bad. You know, it's going to be social media. Brazil is very much, it's one of the most connected countries. So I can anticipate some very, very heavy duty campaigning, which would change the pendulum, and you know, we could have a Bolsonaro win. So what does that mean for Bolsonaro too? Hard to say. I think he's been moderating a little bit some of the, you know, the areas of traditional criticism. The pandemic, interestingly enough, you know, the Brazilians now see that it's gone. It's like, okay, pandemic, you know, when that was a factor that really drove the polls, drove him down in popularity. And talking to Brazilians, they're going like, wait a minute, we're still not quite home free, but it's sort of, people are tired of that and they want to move on. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays into it, and how he will govern. You know, his role with the military, will it change? Will it shift? Some of the criticisms and so that he's had with, you know, traditional groups, the women and LGBTG, will he change? I have a feeling he won't temper that because that's part of his personality. Will the administration be different? Maybe.
Really good. Noam, what are your thoughts? I know I threw a lot of questions out there if you want to take one of them, but and we're running out of time, but just we want to get a couple more minutes of it if we can.
Sure, yeah. I like the question about inequality, I think, because we didn't really talk about inequality, and you know, it's a little odd to talk about the most unequal region in the world without talking about the role that inequality plays. So two things I think are important when we think about inequality in the region. One is we had a whole bunch of protests in the fall of 2019 that everybody sort of forgotten about, and they kind of got tamped down mostly by, you know, with a couple of exceptions like Chile's Constituent Assembly, but mostly by the fact that we then had a pandemic emerge. And I think political leaders in the region know very well that there is still this swell of concern and anger about levels of inequality in the region. I do think that there are ways to address that, and I think, you know, when we saw the sort of initial pink tide, right, the initial sort of wave of leftist governments in the early 2000s, we did see lots of investment. It also happened in the context of the commodity boom, right? So lots of investment in social assistance programs and declining rates of inequality in Argentina and Brazil and in a number of other countries. So there are things that can be done to address those inequalities, and I think we're going to see, you know, governments sort of regardless of who gets elected, try to address those, because I think as the pandemic recedes, we are going to see that upheaval that we saw emerge in late 2019 sort of come back. Have we addressed these issues, or are they still around?
Absolutely. We're seeing rising inflation, concerns about food security. We saw protests in Peru this week. So really, really good point. We have gone over time, and I want to thank our panelists for sticking around for a few more minutes. I'll hand it back to you, Courtney, but thank you so much for these wonderful answers. We got to cover a lot of countries in a very short amount of time, and I appreciate your insights.
Well, thank you, Carin. That was masterful. You took us through a lot of just so much. And Noam, Liliana, thank you, Jorge and Absentia. It was really a fantastic discussion. I learned so much. Thanks for all the terrific questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them, but I think we did get to quite a few, which is fantastic. So thank you, everyone. I think our next event is Russia's Inner Workings, How Putin Keeps Control and How He Might Lose It. That's Tuesday, April 26th, 2022. Again, these are free and open to everyone around the world, so please join us. And again, thank you all. This was really a phenomenal discussion and certainly a lot to keep an eye on. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you. Bye-bye.